Kuzu Sangpo. Welcome to Bhutan e-learning project. This is an environmental science lesson for Key Stage 5, classes 11 and 12. I am Tashi Angzom, a teacher at Khatstapchu Middle Secondary School. Look at these. These are some of the examples of hazards which Bhutan has experienced in the past. The first picture is the landslide. The second picture is the hazard caused by glacier lake outburst flood. And the third hazard here is caused by the flash flood. And the fourth one is caused by the earthquake. Look at these hazards here. We have avalanche, we have the wildfire, we have the heat wave and the drought. Can you now recollect the impact of these upon human lives? When the scale is big, there is a huge loss of life, huge loss of property, and there is a loss on the environmental resources. Now, what do you term this? We term this as disaster. Disaster leads to loss of life, disaster leads to loss of property and causes environmental degradation. We, the Bhutanese, are fortunate as we have lesser human life lost to disasters. Therefore, today we will be discussing on disaster management. Currently, Bhutan is experiencing a biological disaster. Can you recollect what it is? How do you diagnose it? And how do you prevent its effect on health? Yes, you guessed it correctly, it's COVID-19. COVID-19, the biological hazard actually caused by coronavirus, is pandemic in nature. Why is it pandemic? It's pandemic because it has crossed the boundaries of its first region of detection. And not just crossing boundaries and countries, it has even crossed boundaries of continents. There has been loss of life across the world. That's why it can be termed as disaster. In the last class, we have already learned about the different types of hazards, and we also talked how these hazards, such as geophysical hazard, climatological hazard, hydrometeorological hazard, and biological hazard can become disasters. So, to prevent the risk, we have to know about the disaster. For instance, this one, biological disaster, COVID-19. What is it? What is coronavirus? Coronaviruses are a family of viruses that includes the common cold, SARS, for example, and MERS. The most recent COVID-19 outbreak, which we are facing at the moment, involves a new strain that previously had not been identified in humans. This is according to the World Health Organization. According to World Health Organization, how do I know if I have it? People considered at elevated risks are those who live or have traveled in areas where the disease has been spread. Number two, who are at risk? The health caregivers are at risk, who are taking care of the patients of COVID-19. We have to feel fortunate. We Bhutanese are lucky because our system is in place. We need to respect those caregivers, our health workers. We need to respect them and we need to appreciate the sacrifices they have made to give care to us. And who are at risk? Those who have close contact with someone confirmed with COVID-19. So these are at risk. Now, the other people who are at risk are those older adults and people with serious chronic illnesses. So they are the ones who are at risk. So, what are the symptoms? How do you know whether you have the virus within you or not? First symptom is the fever. Then you might have cough. Then you might have shortness of breath. So, if you have that, you need to get yourself checked for that. We need to be mindful of the symptoms in order to prevent the infection to your parents and to your community, because we need to have the self-leadership at this moment. The leadership of the self is important, because as long as we wash our hands, as long as we are aware, as long as we respect the social distancing, if we have the leadership of the self, we can take care of our loved ones, that is our family members, we can take care of our relatives, and the care spreads on to our neighborhood, the care spreads on to our community, and we are going to have a healthy nation at large. You would have heard about the loss of life in thousands around the world. Prevention is always better than cure. Therefore, be reminded to practice these health advices at all costs. How do I protect myself? The first one, you already know, social distancing. Stay away from the other one. Cover your cough and your sneezes. You need to be responsible for that. Then, wash your hands for more than 20 seconds with soap. If you are sick, go to the nearest flu clinic available. However disastrous a disaster may be, it is always best to know how to manage the disaster. Therefore, the expectations of the lesson are, you should be able to, first, explain the phases of disaster management. Number 2, explain disaster management system in Bhutan. Number 3, explain the measures to achieve disaster resilient community. Now, let's recapitulate what we have learned about disaster in the last class. We defined disaster as the impact of natural or human-made hazard which causes environmental loss, increased mortality, illnesses or injury, and disruption of livelihood of the people living in the vulnerable areas. This is defined as disaster. Now, where does the disaster occur? The disaster occurs when a hazard hits a vulnerable community, and the vulnerable community is not able to cope up with the disaster with the available resources in it. People can reduce the risks of hazard by instituting efficient disaster management systems and processes. To minimize the impact of disaster, a systematic disaster management process is practiced worldwide, which consists of the 4 phases. Here are the 4 phases. The first one is preparedness. Second one is response. Third one is recovery. And the fourth one is prevention or mitigation. How do we prepare for a disaster now? The first stage. Preparedness phase. Here, in the preparedness phase, this is a continuous cycle of planning, organizing, training, equipping, exercising, evaluating, taking the correct action to ensure effective coordination during a disaster response. Preparedness increases a community's ability to respond effectively to the occurrence of a disaster. This phase involves developing policies and procedures, assessing available resources, identifying emergency shelter sites, relief activities, and community education. How are we prepared for the disaster, such as the COVID-19, the biological disaster that we are already going through? See, we already have the system in places, the policy in places. We already know where to go, what to do, whom to contact during this disaster. We already have quarantine places. Where should the people be quarantined? We already have the flu clinics available. We already have stocked up the food materials which we might need during the lockdown. We are all given the education awareness on COVID-19. So these are some of the examples of preparedness phase. And it is also crucial to remain aware of the disaster and the hazards at home which might take place, and to maintain its preparedness checklist. For example, what are the things we can do to keep the hazards away and not let it cause disaster at home? Number one, we can move large, heavy objects to a lower shelf. We should not be hanging pictures and mirrors near the beds or near the sofa where we are sitting. We need to fasten our shelves and, the showcases securely, the cupboards securely. We need to brace the overhead light fixtures and fix them properly. We need to properly strap the water heater or geysers to the walls. So these are some of the simple examples that can reduce home and workplace hazards. Now, let's go to the second step, second phase. Second phase is the response phase. The response phase is the actual implementation of the disaster plan and the preparedness. Disaster response, what does it mean? It refers to the organized actions taken during and immediately after disaster in order to ensure that the effects of disaster are minimized and that the affected people are given immediate relief and support. However, it depends on the location and the severity of the disasters. It is actually here in this response phase, it is a combined effort by all the different stakeholders. Everybody is involved there. Example, we have lots of volunteers working for the disaster, during the disaster. We have TESUBs, we have the armed forces, we have our local police, we have the NGOs, we have the private relief organizations, we have the government agency coming there, and sometimes we also have the branches of all the military forces. But the foremost importance is that the people living in that community has to come forward. Instead of just panicking, they have to come forward and help each other. Now, the response phase comprises of the following stages. The first one, search and rescue. What do we do there in search and rescue? The volunteers or the people responsible in search and rescue, they will be searching out and rescuing the vulnerable people, the victims who have been victims of that disaster. Then they will bring in them so that we can give immediate attention of medication. Either we transport them to a better health facility, or what is to be done? The search and rescue team will find those vulnerable victims of the disaster. The second one is emergency and relief. What is needed at the moment? The first basic things such as food, water, medicine, clothing, shelter, these kind of reliefs are provided, the emergency relief. Then the third one, now here they plan for early recovery from the disaster. How does the community wake up? How do they recover from the disaster that has taken place? Then the next one is the development of the community. Now, to better withstand, to be resilient to those kind of disaster, because disaster is something which we cannot prevent, but the community can be developed in order to resist the disaster which can be occurred again in the later future. Then the final phase is medium to long-term recovery. So the plans are developed in such a way that even if these disasters occur, also the community is resilient enough, prepared enough, and can respond to the disaster in a correct way. Now, let's go to the third important phase of disaster management, which is called as recovery phase. The recovery phase focuses on the restoration, getting back to normal, stabilization of the affected area to its previous state, back to the normal state before the disaster actually took place, through reconstruction, repairing and reconstruction of the community's infrastructure, and all the facilities, transportation facilities, communication facilities, all the facilities that we had before, and relocating the population to a safer place if it is not a safe place. If a boulder always comes down, and if it is a zone of a falling stone area, then the community cannot be resettled there again, because the hazards are going to occur. So that's why they need to be relocated into a safer place. The duration of the response phase, it actually depends on the magnitude of the disaster, number one. Number two, it also depends on the preparedness of the country or the nation or the community, how prepared they are. And the duration of the recovery phase also depends on the vulnerability of the community and the accessibility of the affected location, how accessible it is, owing to that the disaster has not affected or obstructed the accessibility to that location. Now, the discovery-recovery phase consists of the following steps. The first step we have is the assessment, disaster assessment, and risk analysis. We need to analyze, we need to assess the disaster first, then we need to analyze what kind of risks can be there because of the occurrence of such disaster. And the second step is activation and planning. The plan comes alive. Then the execution of the recovery plan. Now we need to execute the plans, the policy, the system that we have framed. It has to be executed for the disaster as a recovery plan. Then the final stage is where we have the reconstitution and restoration, bringing back the community to, the better phase it had been before, better than what it had been before the disaster. Now, the fourth and the final phase is the mitigation phase. During the mitigation phase, strategic steps are taken to prepare communities at high risk to minimize disaster impact before it occurs. So this mitigation phase is before the disaster. Any mitigation strategy is inclusive of a range of measures, such as the engineering measures, spatial planning is needed, a degree of economic management has to be there, and the participation of community is important. Every person living in the community has to take up the responsibility of who is going to do what in order to keep away that disaster from coming into their place. Okay, then they have to encompass improved policy, educational awareness of the disaster. Thus, mitigation strategies include both the structural and the non-structural components. These are the two: structural mitigation and the non-structural mitigation. Now, what happens in the structural mitigation? Any physical construction to reduce or avoid possible impacts of hazards. Or we need to apply the application of engineering techniques is to achieve hazard resistance, resilience in structure or system. That is called as structural mitigation. Now, in the non-structural mitigation, what happens? Here, any measures not involving physical construction that uses knowledge, practice, or agreement to reduce risks and impacts, in particular through policies, through laws, raising public awareness, giving education to people, making people aware, giving some people training and education. These are called as non-structural mitigation. The management system for disaster includes, first one, International Declaration on Disaster Management. Number two, the disaster management policies in Bhutan. And the third one is disaster management practices in Bhutan. Now, under the International Declaration on Disaster Management, what is there? We have the Hyogo framework. Then we have the SARC Agreement on Rapid Response to Natural Disasters Reduction. Then, under the disaster management policies in Bhutan, we have National Disaster Risk Management Framework. Then we have Disaster Management Rules and Regulation. We have School Disaster Management Plan. And we have guidelines on them too. Do you remember the mock drills that we do for earthquake, for flood, for fire in schools? Of course you do. Then, under disaster management practices in Bhutan, what do? We have biosafety measures. Then, we have National Biosafety Framework. We have practices on how to be resilient to flood, to earthquakes, mostly the geophysical and hydrometeorological disasters. And now we are already practicing how to manage a biological disaster. Such is the scene of onslaught of hazards and disaster in communities. Therefore, it is the priority of the government and the nation to build community resilience. Community resilience is of vital importance in disaster management. Now, community disaster resilience. What is resilience? It is an ability of a community or society to resist, to absorb, to adapt, and quickly recover from the effects of hazard in an efficient manner without compromising their long-term prospect. The disaster-resilient community necessitates knowledge to design and build in a natural hazard context, minimizing its vulnerability. Community resilience also involves the full range of community-based organizations and agencies for preparedness, response, recovery, planning activities, and broaden the understanding of disaster preparedness. Disaster managed at the community level is actually a replica of disaster management at a national level. If you are able to manage disasters at a community level, it is as good as we being able to manage the disaster at a national level. Now, these are the descriptions of ratings. How can you rate the community resilience? When do you get 1 point? The description is given here. How do you get 2 points? 3, 4, and the best one is when you get 5, a community is rated 5 in community resilience when there is a culture of safety which exists among all the stakeholders living in the community, where disaster risk reduction is embedded in all the relevant policy planning, all the relevant practices that you have in the community, that the attitude and the behavior of cultural safety is also included within the people living in that community. That's when you get 5 points for community resilience. So now it's time. Is your community resilient enough? And what do you have to do to get 5 points for the community resilience? Now, my dear children, what did we learn today? We discussed about disaster of diverse types, which occurs due to natural and anthropogenic effects. In order to minimize the impact and speedy recovery development of systems disaster, we learned that resilience is imperative. The next thing we discussed is for effective delivery of services, disaster management should happen at all levels. Then we also discussed disaster management plan is to save lives, property, and environment. Let's explore. Now that you have learned so much, I have a little task for you. Make a report of how safe is your home based on the 4 phases of disaster management which we have learned today. Discuss with your parents or family members or your guardian while writing the report. How safe is your home based on the 4 phases of disaster management? Now, the second task that you have for today is the world is under the siege of COVID-19. Social activities are all inhibited. We stay at home. So write a report on people's emotional state in this emergency situation. You're supposed to write a report on the people's emotional state in this emergency situation. So, my dear children, thank you so much for attending the lesson. Wash your hands, keep away from others, stay away from others, maintain the social distance, be happy and healthy. Kadinche.